If you want to bring down a skyscraper, you don't hit it with a wrecking ball from the outside. That's amateur work. You find the weakest structural point in its foundation, a microscopic stress fracture in the load-bearing concrete, a compromised steel I-beam hidden deep within the basement, and you plant your charges right there. You let the building's own massive, arrogant weight crush it into dust. I spent 25 years of my life as a structural engineer, identifying the fatal flaws that brought massive structures to their knees. And before I was analyzing concrete and steel, I spent 8 grueling years in the military as a tactical engineer, learning how to dismantle an enemy's stronghold before they even realized they were under attack. I know how things are built, and more importantly, I know exactly how they fall apart. Roland Marsh didn't know a single damn thing about my background. When that billionaire real estate tycoon looked at me, all he saw was a retired widower in a faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots. He saw a man who looked like a simple blue-collar handyman, a guy with grease under his fingernails and calluses on his palms from a lifetime of physical labor. He thought I was utterly insignificant, a peasant he could scrape off the bottom of his expensive Italian loafers. He thought my son, Caleb, was just an uneducated pawn he could push around his golden chessboard until he was bored with him. That was his fatal mistake. Roland built a suffocating cage of money, manipulation, and deceit around my family, locking my son inside. But he never realized that he had locked a military engineer inside with him. He didn't realize I was the man quietly mapping every single steel bar of that cage, measuring the tensile strength of his lies, and preparing for the day I would tear his arrogant empire down to the absolute bedrock. Let me take you back to the beginning so you can understand the architecture of this disaster. My name is Walter Brennan. I'm 63 years old. I raised my son Caleb completely alone after my beautiful wife, Eleanor, passed away from ovarian cancer when Caleb was just 12 years old. The two of us, we are quiet, methodical people. We don't complain when things get hard. We work until our hands bleed. We fix whatever is broken in front of us. And we never, ever run from our responsibilities. Caleb grew up to be a man of absolute, unflinching integrity. He didn't chase wealth. Instead, he taught American history at a public high school in Asheville, North Carolina. He was the kind of man who stayed 3 hours after the final bell to help a struggling student understand the Civil War. He was the kind of man who still wrote thank you notes by hand. He wasn't making a fortune, not even close, but he was shaping the lives of the next generation. I have never been more proud of anything in my life than the man my son became. Then he met Delia. Delia Marsh was warm, incredibly charming, and possessed the kind of brilliant, disarming smile that could defuse a bomb. Caleb fell for her immediately, and he fell hard. She seemed to love him just as fiercely. She remembered the little things he mentioned in passing. She laughed at his terrible history jokes, and she looked at him like he was the center of her universe. But Delia came with a massive overbearing shadow, her father, Roland Marsh. Roland owned half the commercial properties in Buncombe County, along with 3 luxury car dealerships and a sprawling country club. He was a ruthless real estate tycoon with a god complex that could rival a Roman emperor. Roland didn't just walk into a room, he inspected it. He assessed the net worth of everyone, present, deciding instantly who was useful and who was disposable. The first time Caleb brought Delia and Roland over to my modest single-story house for a holiday dinner, Roland barely made an effort to conceal his absolute disdain for my existence. He walked through my front door, wiped his shoes on the mat for an unnecessarily long time, and sneered at the worn-out fabric of my living room sofa. "Charming place you have here, Walter," Roland said, offering a tight, patronizing smile. The word charming dripped with condescension. "Very rustic. I suppose it has character." I didn't take the bait. I simply handed him a glass of neat bourbon, offered him a seat, and spent the rest of the evening observing him. By the time he left my driveway in his chauffeured black SUV, I had the man completely figured out. Roland was a master manipulator, a textbook gaslighter who genuinely believed that anyone with a net worth lower than his was a lesser species of human. He didn't respect my son. He viewed Caleb as a temporary amusement for his daughter. When Caleb and Delia got married 8 months later, Roland hijacked the entire event. He threw a 200-guest black tie extravaganza at his private, gated estate. The champagne was imported, the caviar was endless, and the ice sculptures were carved to look like the Marsh family crest. During the reception, Roland stood up to give the father of the bride toast. He didn't talk about love, commitment, or the beautiful journey the young couple was embarking on. Instead, he talked about standards. He talked about the immense responsibility of joining the Marsh family, looking directly at Caleb when he said it. It sounded less like a welcoming blessing and more like the terms and conditions of a hostile corporate acquisition. I drove home that night alone, a cold, heavy knot twisting in my stomach. When I walked into my empty house, I didn't go to sleep. I went into my study, unlocked my desk drawer, and opened a thick, leather-bound journal. I wrote down the date, the time, and a verbatim transcript of Roland's speech. I began to document. I didn't know exactly what war was coming, but my military instincts were screaming at me to dig a trench. 14 months into the marriage, my granddaughter Nora was born. She weighed 6 pounds, had Caleb's stubborn chin, and a full head of pitch-black hair. Caleb called me from the hospital at 2 a.m, weeping with a kind of overwhelming joy I had never heard from him before. "Dad," Caleb choked out over the phone, "she's perfect. She's just perfect." I'm a dad when I arrived at the hospital and stood next to Caleb, looking at that tiny girl through the nursery glass. Something deep inside my son permanently settled. The nervous energy of his youth evaporated. He was anchored to the earth. From that day forward, Caleb was a father in every single way that has ever counted. He read to Nora every night. He changed every diaper, without a single complaint, and he eventually became the coach of her toddler soccer team. But the trouble didn't announce itself with a blaring siren. The foundation of their life didn't crack all at once. The poison seeped in through the microscopic fissures, slowly, deliberately, over months. It started when Nora was about 8 months old. Caleb came over to my house on a Sunday afternoon, looking exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes resembling bruises. He sat at my kitchen table and told me that Roland had offered him a job. "He wants me to leave the high school, Dad," Caleb said, nervously tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "He wants me to become the community liaison for his flagship real estate firm. He says I'm wasting my potential teaching kids who don't care." "What does a community liaison actually do?" I asked, my voice flat. "I'd be the face of his new development projects, going to town hall meetings, talking to the locals, smoothing over zoning disputes. Because people trust me. But Dad, the salary is 3 times what I make teaching, plus bonuses." I leaned back in my chair. "What does Delia think?" Caleb paused, a flash of conflict crossing his face. "Delia thinks it's the only logical move. She says if I really want to provide the right foundation for Nora private schools, a safe neighborhood, the lifestyle she grew up with, I have to take it. She practically begged me." I asked Caleb what he truly wanted to do in his heart. He looked down at the table and said he was heavily considering it for Nora's sake. I told him to trust his gut and take his time, but I said nothing else. You can't warn a man about a trap when he thinks he's walking into a palace. 2 months later, Caleb resigned from the school district. He was sitting in a 4th-floor corner office in downtown Asheville, behind a massive mahogany desk. He wore a sharp, expensive suit that looked like a suffocating costume on his frame. When I visited him for lunch, he looked absolutely miserable. He was fetching coffee for Roland's senior executives and being paraded out at public meetings to smile and nod while Roland bulldozed local businesses. I knew exactly what was happening. When a powerful, ruthless man hands you something for free, he isn't giving you a gift. He is installing a lever, and one day he is going to pull it so hard it snaps your neck. I didn't act on my suspicions immediately. I needed professional confirmation. That evening, I sat on my front porch with my next-door neighbor, Sam. Sam is a veteran family law attorney who has spent 30 years navigating the ugliest, most venomous divorces in the state. We've shared a fence and 1,000 Saturday morning coffees since before Caleb was old enough to drive. I casually mentioned Caleb's new lucrative job with Roland's firm. I told him about the massive salary bump and the corner office. Sam didn't smile. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, stared out at the street, and narrowed his eyes. Did Roland ever actually give him a formal employment contract, Walter? Sam asked quietly. I didn't know. The next morning I called Caleb and asked him, trying to sound like it was just idle, fatherly curiosity. Oh no, there's no formal contract, Caleb said, brushing off the question. I'm classified as an independent contractor. It's month to month. Roland said it provides more flexibility for both of us and keeps the tax structure cleaner. When I relayed that information to Sam, he just shook his head, a grim, knowing look settling over his features. He didn't need to say a single word. That was the exact moment my protective instincts violently shifted gears. I transitioned from a concerned father into a tactical soldier preparing the battlefield. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was initiating active reconnaissance. I needed to see the inside of Roland's operation with my own two eyes. I couldn't just walk through the front door of his corporate headquarters and demand to see his files. But I knew how massive commercial buildings operated. I knew that the invisible people, the night shift cleaners, the elevator technicians, the repair crews had unrestricted access to every square inch of the property, and nobody ever looked twice at them. I leveraged an old connection I had with a local commercial contracting firm. I asked for a favor, and a week later, I was picking up night shifts as a freelance handyman, assigned to service the intricate HVAC systems in Roland's flagship office building. For 3 grueling weeks, I wore a stained gray uniform with a cheap plastic name tag that simply said Walt. I carried a heavy tool belt, hauled 30-pound Freon tanks up flights of stairs, and blended perfectly into the drywall. I was a ghost, in plain sight. I would be on my hands and knees fixing a vent right outside the boardroom, and Roland's executives would literally step over my legs without even acknowledging my existence. I listened to everything. I overheard Roland screaming at his legal team about exploiting zoning loopholes. I overheard executives discussing shell companies, offshore accounts, and predatory lending practices. But the real gold mine, the intelligence that would eventually burn his empire to the ground, was discovered on a rainy Tuesday night at 2:00 a.m. I was officially scheduled to calibrate the ventilation grates in Roland's private, locked executive suite. He was out of town on a business trip in New York. The security guards knew I was there and left me alone. As I measured the airflow near the back wall of his massive office, my structural engineering instincts kicked in. I noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible discrepancy in the floor plan. The interior dimensions of Roland's office were off by about 6 feet compared to the exterior footprint of the hallway. There was a void space, a dead zone in the architecture. I ran my calloused hands along the ornate mahogany bookshelf lining the back wall. It took me 10 agonizing minutes of feeling the trim before I found it. A hidden, biometric latch concealed beneath a decorative piece of molding. I couldn't bypass the fingerprint scanner, but I didn't need to. I traced the wiring down to the baseboard, pulled out a small military-grade diagnostic tool from my belt, and shorted the magnetic lock. The heavy bookshelf clicked and swung open silently on reinforced hinges, revealing a secret room. It was a small, aggressively climate-controlled vault, devoid of windows. The walls were lined with heavy-duty filing cabinets, and a standalone encrypted server hummed in the corner. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my hands were completely, unnervingly steady. This was enemy territory. I bypassed the simple analog tumbler lock on the primary filing cabinet, using a tension wrench and a pick from my tool belt. I pulled out a small, specialized micro camera I had purchased online, and started photographing documents as fast as the shutter would click. What I found in those files was a master blueprint of absolute sociopathic control. I found the paperwork for the house. Caleb and Delia lived in the beautiful, sprawling brick colonial in the leafy suburb that Roland had publicly presented as a generous wedding gift. It was a lie. The house was owned entirely by an LLC called Apex Holdings. I traced the corporate structure in the files. Roland Marsh was the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings. Caleb's name was absolutely nowhere on the deed. It never had been. Then, I found the employment records. Caleb's massive salary wasn't paid by the main real estate firm. It was funneled through a third-party, disposable LLC. The entire arrangement was deliberately designed so Roland could terminate my son's income on a Tuesday morning, with absolutely zero severance, zero unemployment benefits, and zero legal recourse. Finally, I found the original copy of the prenuptial agreement. The one Caleb had signed 3 years ago, using a high-priced lawyer that Roland had heavily recommended as a favor. I photographed every single page. When I showed those photos to Sam the next day, he went pale. The lawyer Caleb used had a secret 17-year financial relationship with the Marsh family that had never been disclosed. The prenup was a total death trap. If Delia ever filed for divorce, Caleb would walk away with absolutely nothing, no assets, no spousal support, and a heavily compromised claim to custody. Roland Marsh hadn't given my son a beautiful life. He had built him a gilded prison, and Caleb was blindly smiling from behind the bars. But the horrific documents hidden in that secret room weren't the worst of it. The killing blow, the revelation that almost broke my spirit entirely, came exactly 1 month later. Realizing the legal danger Caleb was in, I had officially hired a private investigator. Not a cheap one. I hired Dean Holloway, a former military intelligence officer who operated in the shadows and left no digital footprint. I tasked Dean with digging into the personal, intimate side of Delia and Roland's life. I needed to know every secret they were hiding. Dean spent weeks tracking down former employees, estranged friends, and discarded staff. Eventually, he found a nurse who had briefly worked at the elite, private prenatal clinic Delia used during her pregnancy with Nora. The nurse had been fired months ago over a brutal pay dispute with the clinic's management and possessed zero loyalty to the Marsh family. Dean met her in a diner. 3 towns over, she told Dean something that chilled my blood so thoroughly I felt like I had been plunged into ice water. During a particularly stressful, high-risk prenatal appointment, Delia had suffered a severe panic attack. In the privacy of the examination room, with only the nurse present, Delia had broken down sobbing and confessed a terrifying, earth-shattering secret. She wasn't entirely certain that Caleb was the biological father of her child. I sat in my dark, silent living room for 3 full days after Dean delivered that intelligence report. I didn't eat a single meal. I barely slept for an hour. A blinding, white-hot rage coursed through my veins. I wanted to march over to Roland's gated estate, kick the mahogany front door completely off its reinforced hinges, drag Roland out onto his pristine lawn and unleash absolute hell. I wanted to tear Delia's life apart piece by piece for what she had done to my boy. But rage is a sloppy, uncontrollable weapon. It makes you blind. Precision, patience, and overwhelming evidence are what win wars. I needed indisputable scientific proof. Rumors from a disgruntled nurse wouldn't hold up in court, and they certainly wouldn't be enough to shatter Caleb's reality without destroying him in the process. I built a careful, fabricated little plan. I told Caleb that I was finally putting together a comprehensive family genetic health history. I told him that Eleanor's battle with cancer made me realize how critically important it was to have all our genetic markers mapped out for the future. I said I wanted blood types and basic DNA profiles, and that it would mean the world to me to include little Nora's data in the family tree. Caleb, being the pure-hearted man he was, thought it was a beautiful, sentimental idea. He submitted a sample immediately. He had absolutely no idea that during the following weekend, when Nora was staying at my house for what she called Grandpa's camp, I gently took a secondary cheek swab from her while she was watching cartoons. I sealed both samples, used an assumed name, and sent them via priority overnight shipping to an independent, highly secure private laboratory in California. The agonizing wait for the results took 12 days. When the thick, sealed envelope finally arrived in my mailbox on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, I carried it to my kitchen table like it was an unexploded bomb. The house was dead quiet. I sliced the top of the envelope open with a pocket knife, pulled out the multi-page medical document, and forced my eyes to read the clinical, emotionless text. The letters on the bright white page swam in front of my vision. The alphanumeric genetic codes didn't align. The probability markers were absolute zero. Caleb was not Nora's biological father. It was a devastating, surgical strike to my heart. A betrayal so deep, so fundamentally evil, it threatened to shatter the entire foundation of our world. I held that heavy piece of paper, feeling the immense, destructive weight of the information it contained. If I drove over to Caleb's house and showed this document to him right now, he would react on pure, unadulterated emotion. He would confront Delia in a screaming match. He would confront Roland. He would tip his hand and walk right into their crosshairs without a shred of legal armor. Roland's army of corporate lawyers would instantly butcher him in family court. But I was not looking at her. They would lock him out of his bank accounts, evict him from the house, and he would lose the little girl who looked at him every single day and called him daddy. So I did the hardest, most excruciating thing a father can ever do. I buried the explosive truth. I willingly swallowed the toxic poison so my son wouldn't have to taste it. I folded the DNA results, walked down to my basement, and locked the envelope inside a fireproof wall safe. For the next 16 torturous months, I became a silent ghost in their machine. I watched Delia smile at Caleb over holiday dinners, knowing her secret. I watched Roland belittle my son, knowing his trap. And I smiled back at them. I retained a ruthless, brilliant attorney from Charlotte named Marcus Webb. I paid his massive retainer entirely out of my life savings money. I had been quietly stacking since Eleanor died, money I always meant to give Caleb anyway. We documented every single millimeter of the LLC fraud. Dean Holloway kept digging and miraculously tracked down 2 other former Marsh employees, a property manager named Errol and a regional director named Paulette. Both of them had been lured in with the exact same independent contractor trap and destroyed the exact same way Caleb was about to be. I met with them in secret. I gathered their testimonies and built a rock-solid, undeniable legal pattern of corporate abuse and fraud. I built the explosive charges. I laid the invisible wire. I fortified the trench. And then, I sat in the dark and waited for Roland Marsh to light the fuse. That fateful day finally arrived on a freezing, overcast Thursday morning in late October. At exactly 6:17 a.m., my cell phone vibrated violently on my nightstand. I was already awake. I answered it before the second ring. Dad. Caleb's voice came through the speaker. It was a hollow, trembling rasp, the sound of a man desperately holding his sanity together by sheer force of will. Dad, he locked us out. I sat up, my feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. The 16-month wait was over. The mission was a go. Give me the Citrep, Caleb. Where are you right now? I'm standing in the driveway, he choked out. My office keycard didn't work at the building yesterday afternoon. I thought it was a glitch. Then Roland called me at midnight and said my engagement with the company was permanently terminated. I came out this morning to grab the newspaper, and the garage code wouldn't work. The front door is dead bolted from the inside. There's a private security guard standing in the foyer, watching me through the glass. He paused, a jagged sob ripping through his chest. Dad, Nora's in my arms. Delia didn't even come to the door. She sent me a text message. A damn text message, Dad. She said things have gotten too complicated, and I need to vacate the premises immediately. I closed my eyes for 2 full seconds, actively suppressing the rage, letting the icy, mechanical calm of a seasoned military veteran completely wash over my nervous system. Are you and Nora physically safe right now? I asked, my tone dead flat. Yes, she's still asleep against my shoulder. Listen to my voice, Caleb. Do exactly as I say. Do not argue with the security guard. Do not bang your fists on the door. You turn around. You put my granddaughter in her car seat, and you drive your truck directly to my house. Do you copy? A long silence on the line. I copy. When his truck pulled into my driveway 20 minutes later, the sight almost cracked my ribcage. Caleb was sitting slumped on my front porch steps in the biting morning cold. He was holding little Nora, who was wrapped tightly in his heavy winter coat, still fast asleep, completely unaware that her world had just ended. Beside Caleb were 2 pathetic, hastily packed suitcases. That was it. That was everything left of 8 years of marriage, devotion, and fatherhood, reduced to a pile of luggage on a freezing concrete slab. Caleb stared blankly at the ground. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He looked like a man who had just been hollowed out with a carving knife. He didn't know that I had been ruthlessly preparing for this exact morning for over a year. He didn't know that Roland Marsh, in his infinite arrogance, had just stepped directly onto a primed landmine. I opened the door and ushered them inside. I gently took Nora from Caleb's arms, carried her into the spare bedroom, tucked her into the warm bed, and pulled the heavy quilt over her shoulders. Then I walked into the kitchen, poured 2 steaming mugs of black coffee, and set one down in front of Caleb. He stared at the dark liquid, his hands trembling. "I have nothing, Dad. No job, no house, no money in the joint account. My wife just threw me away like garbage with a text message." "He took it all. He won." "No, he didn't," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, unyielding weight of absolute command. "He just made the biggest, most fatal mistake of his miserable life." Caleb looked up, raw confusion cutting through his agonizing despair. I walked over to the pantry, dropped to one knee, pried up a loose floorboard I had modified months ago, and pulled out a massive, steel-reinforced briefcase. I hauled it onto the kitchen table and snapped the heavy metal latches open. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, son, and I need you to stay completely calm until I am finished." I started pulling out the files, laying them on the table one by one. I showed him the high-resolution photographs I had taken inside Roland's secret room. I showed him the corporate documentation for Apex Holdings, proving the house was held by an LLC Roland, fully controlled, and had never been legally transferred as a wedding gift. I laid out the employment trap, the lack of a legal contract, and the sworn, notarized statements from Errol and Paulette detailing the exact same abuse. I showed him the emails detailing the predatory, compromised nature of the pre-nuptial agreement. Caleb's eyes widened, darting frantically across the sea of documents. His confusion morphed into shock, and then, slowly, as the sheer scale of the deception set in, his face hardened into a dark, simmering realization. You knew," he whispered, his voice shaking. "All this time?" "I've been tracking his every move for 16 months, I said, leaning over the table. He thought he was building an inescapable cage. He didn't know I was wiring every single bar with C4 explosives. Caleb looked at me, truly seeing the military engineer he grew up with, the man who never, ever left a demolition job unfinished. "We can fight this?" "We aren't going to fight this," I corrected him, my eyes locked onto his. "We are going to annihilate him, but there is one more thing, and this is the hardest hit you will ever take in your entire life. Brace yourself." I reached into the final, zippered compartment of the briefcase and pulled out the sealed white envelope from the private laboratory in California. I slid it slowly across the wooden table. Caleb frowned, picking it up. His hands were shaking violently now. The kitchen was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, agonizing ticking of the wall clock. He broke the seal, pulled out the medical document, and began to read. I watched his eyes track across the page. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the genetic markers and the final, brutal conclusion printed in bold text at the bottom. The remaining color drained from his face in a way I had only seen once before, the night his mother passed away. He set the paper down on the table, with extreme care, the way you set down a live grenade when you no longer trust your own hands. His voice broke, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Nora isn't mine, biologically." "No," I said, my voice gentle, but firm enough to keep him grounded. He stared blankly at the wall, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs. The betrayal was absolute, staggering, world-ending. The woman he loved, the woman he had devoted his life to, had built their entire family on a foundation of horrific lies. I wanted to reach across the table and pull my sobbing son into a massive hug to shield him from the pain. But I held my position. A man has to absorb the shock wave, feel the heat of the blast, before he can stand back up and fight. "That piece of paper," I said, pointing a calloused, scarred finger at the lab report, "is biology. It is genetics. It is not fatherhood. You were the man who held her for 3 hours when she had a terrifying fever at 3 a.m. You are the man who taught her how to walk in this very living room. You are her father in every single way that has ever mattered on this earth. And that does not change today, not if I have anything to do with it. Caleb pressed the heels of his hands brutally into his eyes. His broad shoulders heaved exactly once. He didn't make a sound. Then he took a deep, shuddering breath that filled his lungs. When he slowly lowered his hands, the devastated, broken husband was entirely gone. In his place sat a man forged in the scorching fire of ultimate betrayal, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying, laser-focused clarity. "What's the play, Dad?" he asked, his voice dead of all emotion. "The play," I smiled grimly, showing my teeth, "is total, unmitigated retribution. We didn't file a quiet lawsuit. We didn't send a polite letter of intent through mediators. I called Marcus Webb in Charlotte, gave him the green light, and we unleashed absolute hell. The ambush was orchestrated with flawless military precision. Roland Marsh was hosting his annual highly publicized charity gala at his sprawling country club that Saturday night, a massive, high society event packed to the brim with his billionaire investors, corporate partners, and corrupt local politicians. It was his cathedral of ego, the place where he felt most untouchable. We walked through the heavy double front doors of the country club. Right as Roland was stepping up to the grand microphone on stage to give his arrogant opening address. Caleb wore a sharply tailored, pitch-black suit. I wore my heavy work boots, my dark jeans, and a thick leather jacket that perfectly concealed the reinforced, steel knuckles strapped tightly to my right hand. The massive ballroom fell dead silent as we marched aggressively down the center aisle. Roland stopped speaking mid-sentence, his face instantly twisting into an ugly, furious sneer. Delia, standing near the front row, wearing a diamond necklace, went completely pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the emergency exits. "What is the meaning of this?" Roland boomed over the microphone, his voice dripping with false authority. "Security! Remove these men from the premises immediately. They are trespassing." Two massive, muscle-bound private security guards in cheap black suits stepped aggressively into our path, blocking the aisle. "Time to go, old man," the larger guard growled, reaching a thick, meaty hand roughly toward Caleb's shoulder. I didn't blink. I didn't hesitate. Decades of ingrained tactical muscle memory took over in a microsecond. I stepped sharply inside the guard's reach, grabbed his thick wrist, twisted it violently to break his balance, and drove my steel-reinforced right fist directly into the center of his face. The sickening crack of his nose, shattering, echoed like a high-caliber gunshot through the cavernous ballroom. The massive guard's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the marble floor like a sack of wet cement, instantly unconscious. The second guard completely froze, his hand hovering uselessly over his radio, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Stay calm," I ordered, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a serrated hunting blade. "Nobody else needs to get hurt tonight. Stand down." Roland Marsh was left completely, utterly speechless. His jaw hung open, his face flushed purple with shock. He looked at the bleeding guard on the floor, then slowly looked up at me, finally realizing that the handyman he had despised and underestimated was an apex predator who had just breached his inner sanctum. Caleb walked calmly past the frozen second guard, stepped up onto the stage, bypassed the microphone entirely, and stood inches away from his former father-in-law. Caleb pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and slammed it violently onto the wooden podium. What the hell is this?" Roland stammered, his god complex fracturing in real time in front of his investors. "That," Caleb said, his voice echoing loudly in the dead-silent room, "is a physical copy of the massive federal lawsuit filed at exactly 4:00 p.m. today. It comprehensively details your fraudulent LLC structures, the illegal, undocumented eviction of a resident, the blatant violation of state employment laws, and the coercion involving a compromised, paid-off attorney on my prenuptial agreement." All the remaining color drained from Roland's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Furious whispers and gasps erupted from the crowd of wealthy investors behind us. "You have absolutely nothing," Roland hissed under his breath, desperately trying to salvage his shattered pride. I own everything. You're a beggar in a borrowed suit. I stepped up onto the stage, standing shoulder to shoulder with my son, presenting an impenetrable wall. I leaned forward and looked Roland dead in his panicked eyes. You own a house of cards, Roland, I said quietly, my voice vibrating with menace, loud enough for only him and Delia to hear. And I have the original blueprints. We have Errol's sworn testimony. We have Paulette's financial records. And I know all about the secret, biometric vault hidden behind the bookshelf in your private office. I photographed everything. We have it all. Roland stumbled backward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked frantically at Delia, searching for support. But Delia was staring at Caleb, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. And Delia, Caleb said, turning his cold, emotionless gaze to his wife. My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow regarding full primary custody. I know the absolute truth about Nora's biology. I've known for a while. Delia gasped, a horrific strangled sound, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands, weeping hysterically. You made one fatal mistake, Roland, I said, leaning in so close he could smell the coffee on my breath. You arrogantly tried to demolish a man's life without bothering to check the strength of his foundation. Caleb is built of stronger, harder stuff than you will ever understand in your miserable life. And me? I'm the guy who brings the wrecking ball. We turned our backs on them and walked calmly out of the ballroom. Not a single person, security or otherwise, dared to try and stop us. Behind us, the room completely erupted into absolute chaos as furious investors began shouting at Roland, demanding immediate answers about the fraud allegations. The Marsh Empire was officially collapsing. The ensuing legal slaughter took exactly 4 months. It was a complete and total bloodbath in the courts. Marcus Webb absolutely eviscerated Roland's high-priced legal team. Because of the specific arrogant way Roland had structured the holding company, his failure to ever transfer the house created enforceable, ironclad rights under state law. It was legally ruled a broken promise of a gift. The judge furiously ordered the deed transferred immediately and solely into Caleb's name. The illegal employment claims triggered a massive state audit of Roland's entire firm. Roland was legally forced to pay out hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid compensation, extreme punitive damages, and all of our legal fees. The prenuptial agreement was tossed out of court, entirely with extreme prejudice due to the blatant, documented conflict of interest with the Marsh-funded attorney. Roland didn't go to federal prison. His crimes were expertly structured to stay strictly on the financial and civil side of the legal line. But his reputation and legacy were completely incinerated. 2 of his largest commercial partners read the court filings and immediately pulled their massive funding. A multi-million-dollar downtown development deal he had chased for 3 years completely fell through. The Marsh name became utterly radioactive in Buncombe County. Nobody would take his calls, and Delia? When she fully realized her father had treated her husband like disposable trash, and when Caleb filed for primary, unshared custody armed with the devastating, documented truth of her darkest secret, she finally broke. To her credit, she didn't even try to fight in court. She quietly handed over the remaining financial documents Caleb needed and signed the custody agreement without a single word of protest. She knew deep down that she had lost the only genuinely good man she had ever known. Last Saturday, we threw Nora a massive, princess-themed 4th birthday party in the sprawling backyard of Caleb's beautiful brick colonial house, his house, fully owned, legally ironclad, with his name bold on the deed. I sat on the wooden deck in the crisp autumn air, letting my giggling granddaughter jam a crooked, sparkly paper crown onto my head, loudly declaring me the king of the frozen mountain. Caleb stood by the smoking grill, holding a pair of tongs, watching us. He was smiling. It was a real, deep, genuine smile. The dark shadows that had haunted his eyes for years were completely gone. He was a father, unbroken, wealthy, and absolutely victorious. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. They ask if I regret keeping my own son in the dark for 16 grueling months. while I secretly built the legal case. They ask if I feel bad for letting him walk into the horrific ambush of his eviction, completely unprepared. I don't regret a single second of it. A titanium shield doesn't explain its structural composition to the soldier it protects. It just takes the heavy kinetic impact. I took the hit so my son could survive to win the war. If there is a lesson to be extracted from the rubble of this story, it's incredibly simple. The most truly dangerous people in the world rarely yell. They smile, they shake your hand warmly, and they build a comfortable, invisible cage around you, one bar at a time while you aren't looking. If someone hands you a house, a high-paying job, or a bright future, you better make damn sure your actual name is on the legal paperwork. Love, generosity, and legally behind contracts are not the same thing, and the manipulative people who tell you not to worry about the difference are the exact ones counting on you to stay blind. If you've ever had someone with money or power look right through you, deciding your life was theirs to casually control and destroy, tell me about your experience down in the comments. You aren't as alone in that struggle as you might feel.